Hello everyone, today we talk about the refinement of holy war during the reforming papacy. Specifically, we will quote some dispositions from the time that goes from the pontificate of Leo the Ninth to the one of Alexander the Second. So we're basically in the third quarter of the 11th century. Quite turbulent moment, as you know. And not just for the papacy as a whole, but and the relation with the empire, of course, were quite strained, but a bit for all of Europe. That was fundamentally turning the tide, shifting the balance, let's say, of gravity from, say, the Islamic world, especially as far as the trade one was concerned, but in a broader, properly expansive sense, right? Regaining the initiative, and thus defining the further, better improving the principles of holy war as such. These are the years of the Norman conquest of England and of southern Italy. Also of mounting Reconquista, as we have made multiple videos exactly about some of the rulers we will name now in Iberia. And behind all these initiatives stood the firm hand of the papacy that was essentially, in fact, defining, organizing, and properly expressing a vision of what was the incipient papal monarchy, of course, but also the older and finally universal in the face of a, in fact, Catholic Christendom, as the West had basically been compacting now under the guidance, at least of a spiritual figure. Because these are not the years of the Crusade yet, but as you know, this process would culminate also with the first expedition in the Near East. That was nothing short of extraordinary, a true miracle as it was seen at the time. And all without the involvement practically of any major secular ruler in Europe, right? Because the emperor was excommunicated, the king of... everybody was busy doing something else, which is also an indicator, as a matter of fact, of some of the crusading dynamics that in the final, let's say, failure should not, in auto merit list, should not overshadow actually the consistent ones in the Iberian Peninsula, in the Baltic, and generally speaking, the overwhelming compaction, the further compaction of Western power during the Great Medieval Civilization, thus the peak of imperial power, independently also from the strictly formal institutions. And this actually is part of a more traditional view of the wall, because the idea is that you do not own an imperium just for the sake of it, right? Ask Constantinople, right? And even in this case, the investiture controversy and the essentially the victory of the papacy with the Concordat of Worms, at least as far as the Italian prerogatives were concerned, but later also the emergence of France, for example, as the major power in Europe as opposed to the empire, of course, reflected the bit of the old issue of the approximations of who and why by form should be the ruler, which could conflict with who did actually hold power, which is basically the single most important thing, traditionally wise, in terms of effective imperial dignity, and thus the right of ruling in the name of God. So today we do not look specifically at the various popes. Of course, we will mention some of them. I would like to stick to the defining principles of the incipient crusade, right? I made lots of videos about crusade, not as many as, medieval warfare-based channel, essentially, could do, right? But we have dealt with the bit of the fact of the myths that we have been fed about crusades, such as the fact that they would have this would have been allegedly wars of religion proper, as if, other wars fought out of the terrible Roman Church were not wars of religion since ever. Like, every single war was exclusively fought in the name of God, way before any even Christianization of the way. It was exclusively the only possible metaphysical, the only possible definition in the world. And it's very strange how, of course, the deeply rooted anti-clericalism, materialism, and more that has basically manifested in the last couple of 100 years without properly any trace of reminiscence of any actual historical knowledge, has pushed, again, the world to reason in one of the single, if not probably the single most narrow-minded one that we have ever witnessed in the history of mankind. And when it comes to history, you see, this is not a matter of proving whether God exists or not on the base of, I don't know, quantum physics or whatever. This is about even knowing what the doctrine that lay behind that, and why did these people believe what they did, which is, I think, a far more important thing, morally and scientifically, in order to understand humanity, right? And not just how, mechanics work, whether you prefer the Einstein one or the quantum one, but these should be, in fact, interpreted still within a frame that doesn't factually know anything about the outer, in fact, unknown, that it could, but that has nothing to do with just per se excluding God and what is God, right? Because that, if you don't even start defining that, or even if you do not start properly realizing that you cannot personally define it, and not because it's your invention, but because it's actually a scientific principle for which that is equally fideistic in many ways, because, again, literally the infinite in our mathematical language is at the base of any scientific necessity, is literally just, we don't know. It literally means, that symbol means we do not know, right? So there is you cannot split gnostically these factors from one another. And interestingly enough, in the 11th century that we're looking at today, they were also in part trying to do so. That is to say, there always were the people who fundamentally needed to twist the fair play of this all on the base of their narrow, in fact, their limitations, their short-sightedness, and ultimately the anti-civilizational function that religion instead has, and that for millennia you've been told, and there was even actually a consensus about, of universal scale, and hardly, again, the kind of war of religions or culture, whatever, that you can imagine. Like, it was a conflict stemming from the competition to the obedience to the divine principle, right? And so even framing it in these terms should, I think, make of course, the general I hate the term mainstream, because of course the mainstream does not exist, right? Just weak people need to think that there is a mainstream, because they cannot conceive, of course, the complexity of the world, in which, of course, that the God calls us traditionally to understand ourselves with our power, not with a superstitious delusion that there are evil people that basically block things. And where are you here, right? You're basically admitting to be a lesser person for others to step on you, right? Which is also the entire point here. But we'll talk about here penance, regulation of the holy war. The one was waged, for example, against the Muslims and not against the Jews, right? It's another thing I never understood in many ways. Or say I understood, but not to say how can a human being be so dumb to think things like this in an anti-Semitic way that the Jews would be ruling the world, and if you are the master race, why would the Jews even be able to rule the world and you not, right? It's such a stupid argument, just for, of course, the entire historical knowledge you can have about these topics, but it properly reflects the sub-personal level that nationalism and socialism have literally, in fact, transfigured people under, because we constantly transfigure. This is the interesting aspect of the wall. So any kind of, let's say, of determinism and kind of settled categorical BS regarding the potential of mankind is the same measure of the value of a person, and that's also something that, of course, the Fourth Estate doesn't want to hear, because otherwise it would have to admit its own inferiority, and of course they cannot do so, even though they know perfectly well that that is the case. But that's another issue that I always like to point out. But you would think that I'm fixated, and probably I am, right? But the point is that you cannot avoid to study these topics and not having it, written in cubital characters in front of you, like this is the actual thing at the end of the day, right? And so it's perennial, and that's in fact the universal call that ever less people are ever able to respond. So we can start from 1053, when Leo IX, famously enough, marched at the head of an army against the Normans of southern Italy, which had been framed, in fact, as per se a sort of holy war, as any other, again, that had ever been waged, right? There wasn't a shift in principle here, right? Earlier popes had already engaged in military activity, notoriously. The problem now was how was the reforming papacy to put themselves in front of such measures, because it was a matter of regulating the whole, right, that had, of course, to have a universal value. So not just for the papacy that was claiming natural infallibility at that point, and yet to actually, because the Dictatus Papae is from 22 years later, but already the inherent principle of a church, right, stands in the at least in the standards that had been basically the wall, the ones of purity, around which the entire investiture controversy had de facto already been revolving. We will see it now, because this involved already open warfare, not just in the case of Civitate, as we will see now, but for example, in the case of the Pateria and in the clash, in fact, against the Holy Roman Emperor, the Great Saxon Revolt, and more, right? So it was just the part of the political dialectics from quite a long time, and just this was a universal power, so its absolute value, or at least the tendency towards it, was always to be considered, especially towards the institution, it was naturally transcendentally meant from a spiritual point of view, and that could not be denied, because, as you know, never papacy or empire disconfessed each other, and were actual allies, institutionally speaking, right? So the investiture struggle was a much different thing in that regard. So, since the reforming papacy could not longer look for help to the Holy Roman Empire, there would be a parenthesis to open about the Byzantines, because until the 12th century, fundamentally, Rome did look at Constantinople for solving some problem, but at least not quite so much as it was doing for the Western Empire since the Carolingians, but even many ways before, at least within a Western dimension. Because, however, at this point, the papacy was at war with the Emperor Henry IV already, right? Again, I have a playlist called investiture controversy. You can easily find all what you're interested in there. And the papacy had thus to organize the defense of its own interests, and especially raising troops for its own war, right? And that's where the Normans came into play in many ways, because at this point, initially, as Civitate in fact shows, the papacy was at war with them, because these were essentially Mordeirs, right, coming from actually hardcore westernized areas of Europe, right, hardly kind of in the say in the Viking guise that some wants to see the Normans in general, even though we're still, in the 11th century. Technically, the Viking era is not ended yet, but these people are technically Normans of Normandy, right? So something that during the previous generations had been molding as a perfectly efficient and identical copy of the Western Frankish one. And that had been exploiting essentially the collapse of the Byzantine authority in southern Italy, that thus was basically open, right, for conquest in a way. There was no major player here that could consistently recompact power from a local point of view. And the Normans being quite warlike, quite, in fact, as we were just saying, updated also in arms and tactics, thought well to enter, to monopolize. The Hauteville took a while, right, to compact their own power. At some point, it recollapsed once again. Eventually, Robert Guiscard, that we mentioned the other day, by the way, in the video about Alexius I Comnenus, was at that point, in fact, succeeding in not just recompacting southern Italy, but also invading Sicily, and then the Byzantine Empire, and more, right? So, and had been, installing themselves in the region, and eventually even realizing that receiving the papal support was incredibly beneficial to their interest, right? In supporting the papacy with an iron arm was the way of doing so. Actually, the Normans came to sack Rome at a point when Henry IV retreated from it, but you understand how complicated the situation really is, because we're talking about different layers of power overlapping and shifting at the same time. So that's a very complicated history we will have to deal for this 11th century on another occasion. If you're interested, I just created new playlists based on the century, so if you're interested, say, just about the 11th, you can find similar topics more or less connecting with each other on this base, right? The point, however, about southern Italy is that it had always been historically seen by the Roman papacy as its own private possession, right? The papacy had owned an unspeakable amount of latifundia in southern Italy since kind of ever, right, historically. And it was always aiming at recovering them. Naturally, Sicily had been lost to the Muslims, etc., but southern Italy especially had always had an important connection with the papacy from a political point of view, which would be actually further increased in Norman times, right? Because this was necessary to govern, even just at such a close distance from Rome, with the benefits, but also the costs that this entailed. We will see that again on another occasion, but that's also to explain why the Pope had initially gone at war against the Normans. By the way, as you know from the history of the Battle of Civitate, which never made yet, but so essentially a papal coalition counting Romans, Longobards, and Swabians, German mercenaries that also made their showdown, but were basically all overwhelmed by the Norman cavalry tactics, right? And that's also a very important measure of the civilizational development of the Western world by that point. And again, we're looking essentially at the Frankish axis. That would consolidate even further with the papacy at some point. It had already been there, however. Aside from this, it was obvious that anyone who would take arms against the papacy was essentially doing something wrong, right, in a way or another. This could be debatable as long as you could point at the unfitness of the office of a given pontiff, right? But this was not much the case of the Normans, who really were kind of land grabbers that had come there because they just spoke the language of power. They knew how to use this sword and the war horse, and were not really making too many mysteries about the reasons why they were there. And naturally, they considered what they had acquired in southern Italy earned, right? Because that is actually in Nuce the actual point of the imperium in the first place. So it was very important politically, internationally, also to affirm such power in front of the universal ones, to have such recognized, in fact, from both sides, actually, in many ways, but also to create, as it would be in the case of the secular Normans, but actually also the ones of England, we will see it now, basically the single most politically compact Latin Germanic powers, right, at the time. But regarding the Holy War, Leo the Ninth had very likely, right, I think, at least it's debated, but I think so, promised, as it had already been happening in Mediterranean, in Spain, etc., forgiveness of sins in return for the support, in that case in the war waged against the Normans, right? The papacy had already been experimenting this. The Italian maritime republics had already started sweeping the western Mediterranean of the Saracen bases. The princes of the Reconquista had been, hammering down many Islamic taifas, essentially supported by the papacy, especially in the measure in which the latter sent Western knights, Frankish knights, to help the Spaniards in the process, and thus it had to justify such mission. What would you earn actually by going at war against the infidels in Spain? And wars among Christians, of course, had been already fought already, such as this one, because the Normans were Christians. In any case, the Pope on this occasion declared that the participation in his campaign against the Normans was pleasing to God, right, and promised that the fallen would go to heaven. We should open a huge parenthesis, but I will skip it, because I have already discussed this in the videos about the Indo-European religion, and so the entire concept of simply dying in battle is per se never, it's not meant to be the deal. Of course, there is a concept of extreme sacrifice that asymptotically should tend towards the infinite, but the degree by which this happens is always kind of man-made, and thus nobody can answer the question here whether it is possible to save oneself, but in any case it cannot happen unless you are God yourself, right? And so you always need grace by yourself, by deserving, entering in synchrony with the universal order and achieving salvation. The papacy was essentially telling, and they say people were aware at the time of this, right? Because especially the knights, that of course we don't have mostly the written voice, etc., had always been leading since millennia with the perfect understanding of the fact that the cingulum militaris per se entailed a magic power, right, of imperial nature that had, of course, always to be proven, right? In tradition, you always have to say, okay, I'm fit for this, prove it, make it happen. And the most interesting thing about this battle is that, of course, the Normans won over the papacy and even captured it. So such defeat called the same religious basis of the undertaking into question, because the concept in itself is even subtler. Because let's say if you die in battle, the chances are that you're not actually winning. It may happen just per se. Just think about the ancient devotsu and these kind of practice that entailed essentially the sacrifice, especially of the commander that detained Imperium. So it's not just a warrior like any other, but still there is, even for anyone taking part in the fight, of course, in fact, almost an ecclesiastical dimension, like a spiritual dimension that is not just the individual per se, but is collective in nature, because whatever you do does change the world forever anyway, so you're kind of always infinitely responsible for anything you do, and of course also that you don't do, right? So there are, again, I have to make videos about this because it's more complicated than it already sounds, but to make the long story short, there are two currents regarding the idea of victory and defeat. In other words, if you're defeated, there's no such thing like you made it, right? Personally, right? Of course, in a personal sense, you will have a unique connection with the universe that is your deal, has to do with your conscience, it has to do with, of course, your predisposition. But in practice, that was evidently not necessarily enough, right? So what the actual tradition says is that even this concept is liminal, because if you can achieve that salvation, it's just because you can literally change the entire world in the process and to the extreme, right? You can become a sort of godlike figure yourself, and again, you understand that if you take God as an absolute, this is also not quite possible unless you are in the same place, and that's why Christianity actually had came about in an age of men and not of gods anymore. Basically, was meant to fix this issue. That is to say, there will be a divine sacrifice as an intercession to the sins of the same world, so that you can basically hope to always be saved. If you accept, however, still godlike sacrifice is possible to be carried out. And so, even though, again, there is this idea that Christianity changed anything compared to the old tradition, and especially Catholicism per se, I think we're wrong, because they're basically saying the same thing, right? They're just saying it in a way that sounds different, but it's actually not, because the same concept of self-sacrifice, of holy war, of salvation, of grace, of faith, of transfiguration are the actual same ones, right? So there is still a deep connection between the inner predisposition and the actual works. This is the reason why I don't want to digress, because otherwise we will never end talking about this. But I promise I will check this stuff, because it further in other videos, because it's not simple at all. Basically, it's telling you that in a way or another we're somehow doomed until we do the thing ourselves, right? And so there can be an example, there can be a sort of inspiration, it can be a model, but there can never be someone who does the thing for you, right? Naturally, in the 11th century, we're talking about a very already modern and secular world, when, of course, people would superstitiously believe that just dying the crusade would give you something extra, at least in the eyes of God, in terms of your possibilities of salvation. But this was in many ways just a made up, right? It's not important per se. It's not different than, again, what anything else was happening in the world at the time. This is valid for the same Shi'at. It's valid for anyone. You don't have a preferential way to make it just because you wish for it, right? So this is a human universal condition and doesn't change on the base of religion, right? You can frame it the way you want, but the things are exactly by the same absolute standards God is meant to be. So you can't really kid about that. This was, however, felt, and it is not inadequate in this regard, because it was meant as a way to still, however, come closer to God. It almost, again, in fact, as an act of faith, not because you can rationally hope to understand the thing, right? Because the distance is unintelligible. In any case, dying in battle for defending the church was definitely seen as a honorable way to go, because the church was embodying, and the skyrocketing of Western civilization through it simply was, demonstrated by itself an institution, the power of which on earth was worth dying for, right? There is the idea, of course, that the imperium cannot be obtained even by the commander if it doesn't receive, of course, the collective support. This is the same concept of why you get excommunicated. Why, if you don't go to church, you're not part of the church, at least, because that's also another issue. You cannot receive the Holy Ghost, because if you reject the civilizational, communitarian value, right, that the mankind is expressing by making this, in fact, gigantic effort, coordinated effort, so something that has a true form, a hierarchy, and it's divinely modeled, you are basically going against the same divine force, and thus you're basically pretending that you are enough, while the human standards tell you that you're evidently not, because I don't know who you are, but likely you're not God yourself, and thus you are basically rowing backwards in terms of what mankind can accomplish. This is the concept behind also crusade warfare per se, because of course it's a moral clash, it's an enterprise, it's a political act, and it must be motivated according to a rationale, which in the defense of the church does definitely have a powerful meaning, historically, culturally, politically, spiritually, and more, right? This is the issue. You can still lose, though, and the loss there may puzzle, because if you essentially indoctrinate yourself into thinking that your agenda is just the right one, and it's a kind of obviously faulty one because you're just a fallen kind, but you still delude yourself in that, you're kind of sinning. And actually the defeat of the same papacy at Civitate embodies this, right? And Leo IX would grapple himself with the problem, comparing his war against the Normans, in that case, with the struggle against the heathen. There was something about the Normans, of course, and inspired Christians was, being Christian, I mean, remember of the previous centuries, what the Vikings had been, all this kind of thing, and of course their paganism, etc. But the ideas on the liberation of Christendom per se, right, independently again from what happens in that specific contingent reality that is not transcendental, and thus therefore it's flawed anyway. So you can even have the papacy losing, right, because it's just people, and then the Holy Ghost is another thing in this sense, when these people actually do enter in syntony with the divine order, you can use the concept of fighting for defense of Christendom, and thus fighting for the truth, in other words, as a early motive of crusading theory, right? Some would say propaganda, but actually yes, because it propagated, it was also, the way of recruiting new troops. But it's never just about the mere, okay, it's because the papacy said that. Okay, what did it, you should always ask yourself, what did actually the papacy represent at the time? Which is always the question that nobody answers, right? Is it just tell you those things, there were, the cadets that the establishment wanted to get rid of, it's economical reasons, because wars are all about economics, man, and all this kind of stuff. And they don't even try to even frame the thing in an actual historical, would be enough, not even spiritual or anything, context. In the Vitae of the same Leo IX, and also the polemical literature of the investiture controversy, we can find the presentation of the dead in such holy war as a martyr, right? In other words, fighting for God in these wars was essentially a preferential way to achieve that breaking of the spiritual, let's say, of the soul's bodily circuit, and essentially being flashed with this vision that could be either the one, it was technically the one of your death, or at least of the transcendence of your human nature, but at that point you had either to tame and thus be victorious in saying yourself, at least in that, with that hugely liminal problem that is, what does that actually mean, right? And or succumbing to them. We've talked about this. We talked about the Furies, the Rennies, the Philtias, and so on, that all are actually divine wisdom if tamed, right? And thus Athena, like the concept properly of reason as the root of civilization, but also, of course, reason stemming from a wisdom, actually an experience of war that is always and necessarily achieved through the summoning of the darkest forces. And then in Athena you have the prototype there of the effect of the celestially accomplished deal, right? She is the daughter of Zeus and so on, but this is not the same for you, right? Athena is nothing but also the same divine wisdom that the same knightly circles of the High Middle Ages venerated as in the form of Mary at that point, but truly as this metaphysical symbol of absolute, of divine female principle that you had naturally to possess and become one with, so re-accomplishing metaphysical unity through the same cosmic struggle and the opposition that the two archetypes, of course, entail when the clash has yet to happen. So in a similar way, the papacy, because that's the symbol of the church herself, that's the symbol of the empire and the papacy, right? So the idea is that you have to be up, even as a man, to the standards of the heavenly maiden. And that's the entire point of the empire and the papacy. And the fact that, of course, the world broke that unity, and so we need now to cope with, at least at the time when they still existed, we still have the papacy, but we have a problem as far as the empire is concerned, and not quite completely, because there's always an hegemonic power of some kind that we have to, in a sense, respect, for the same reason that we're not them, or at least that we can't be redeemed true, and that's always the point, or make our own otherwise. whereas other civilizations stuck to the idea that, for example, this principle was not broken, and nor had to coexist in the same figure. For example, the Byzantines, right? And at that point, why did the West prevail there? And in a traditional guise, it's a matter of that having, in my opinion, the investiture controversy beautifully highlights this, having reactivated the moral force needed to make this male and female principle coping with one another, and not just pretending there to exist by when it's sclerotically not functioning anymore, because you're not up to the standard anyway, and the principle also shifts towards a direction rather than another, actually the one of the Great Mother, and so on. So it's a bit of a tricky topic if you hear it from the first time. But if you get the dynamic, you start appreciating it. I mean, the St. Normans prove to be able to defeat the papacy in open field, but then they are somehow schooled in that civilizational idea, and they marry the church themselves, and so they actually become very successful in the process. So there is always an incredibly living and evident mechanism of this kind in human history, in politics, and so on. There are examples of martyrs that were properly called so by the church. And again, the concept of martyrdom is interesting because, again, martyr in Greek means witness. So the idea is that the martyr witnessed Christ. Literally, they saw Christ, right, the moment of the death, right? Because the concept, of course, in Christianity is that as a medium, he has to be there in the moment of the highest confrontation. But of course, it's still kind of a frightening, judgmental moment, right? When you have to fight the strongest, which normally, in the history of martyrdom, think about fighting against the beasts in the arena or something, but that's a bit of a stereotype. But more concretely, the idea, as it was understood by the papacy and others in the 11th century, is that at least saying that having died as a martyr, so having at least witnessed the deal, right, and having understood the thing, and having died actually in the process, though, that's where the ambiguity is. Thus, even if made saints, still, keeping the question open whether they could have simply have been saved by God per se, right? That there is always a question about that, because it always eventually gets down to the individual. That's what you cannot know, because it's between you and God. It's the self there that does the thing. You cannot respond in that sense for, like, if you haven't been able to control that person for them as far, and that also manifests your own personal limitation, because these were episodic, in fact, events and leaders, and that's, for example, Erlenbald, the champion of the Milanese Pateria, that had been killed by his opponents that had initially supported him actually against the Germanic interference in the Milanese affairs, but that eventually had died in battle. This was a Capitaneus of Milan, and also part of the same family of the Bishop of Milan, so we're talking about men of war in the strict sense. The same can be seen in the epitaph of the German anti-king Rudolf of Rheinfelden, who died in 1080, right at the head of the Great Saxon Revolt against Henry VI. And in the epitaph, it's written Mors sibi vita fuit, ecclesiae cecedit, right? Because for him, death was life, because he was killed for the church. This concept is very interesting because it stresses the awareness of the fact that not just the death could have been enough per se, because it says mors sibi vita fui. So not simply everybody can do this, but why? Because he had been killed for the church. So he had allegedly made such an effort that was seen as absolute, at least as at this point, given the aforementioned collective standard of the same church, the church could be fit right in its offices for that role, aside from the ghostly nature of it. It was not the value of his death as witness to the faith which earned him the martyr's crown in this case, though, but the fact that he fell in battle against the Christian enemies of the church. Right, so given an extra step to the civilizational value of the church per se, for which you can die even fighting against other Christians as long as you're fighting for the church specifically. And so for a principle that goes beyond, of course, and that at that time was quite political, evidently, but that was seen as having been done in at least in some sort of universally functional way, right? The fact that Henry IV, for example, as absolute, in theory, absolute secular ruler, could not, at the end of the day, even win the clash against the church, was meant to highlight the sacrifice of these individuals that had rose against him to actually accomplish what the church could, right? And that at that point was being manifested as basically the necessity for the same life of the church. It is to say, the emperor cannot basically dispose of the ecclesiastical offices as he pleases, because he just has to do something else. And the as far as the lay investitures that some, of course, clergy had, he was to be, of course, he had his own pertinence, but from a spiritual point of view, he didn't have the power that only the church, as far as, again, of the ecclesiastical investitures were concerned, had instead the prerogative of. This was also what was mostly being fought politically for, right? Actually an important deal, as you understand, but also not, in theory, the absolute one that would have required, in fact, just as a standard, much greater cooperation of the empire and the church. And that was also seen as a reason, like, we surely have a long way to go, but if we start fighting for this reason, they're definitely not doing the right thing. And the church in the second half of the 11th century actually was a moral winner of it all, because a bit of the same reason we mentioned before when talking about lay control on the First Crusade, which had highlighted how the temporal power had somehow lagged behind compared to the, in fact, incredibly fast monarchic compaction that the church had, in fact, accomplished in such a actually short time, and actually in a way that nobody really had prefigured up to. Again, it didn't have to happen necessarily, right? For especially for how the situation had been settled mostly since Ottonian times. Naturally, there were many elements making leverage in that direction, but it was really an invention of those popes, of that church that succeeded also against the empire. So this last aspect, however, of martyrdom for having fought for the church essentially turned, the fighting for the church into a way for an individual warrior to save his own soul. Right? It's as if it had been a preferential path to it. Right? It could happen in other ways, but this was kind of more effective. Let's put it this way. And interestingly enough, this pattern of interpretation successfully displays the notion that victory or defeat were God's way of indicating which party was in the right. And many people could say, but you said yourself that it's actual power that is being displayed there. Yes, this is true. There is also another matter. That is to say, especially as far as we talk about universal powers, we're assuming here, of course, a transcendental dimension. In other words, fighting for the church cannot disappear, right? The church lives on spiritually till the end of time, and the gates of hell are not meant to prevail, even though the threat is always posed. And this is actually a metaphor for saying that as far as humanity exists, there is always a potential for, and there is always a minimal kind of positivity going on, even in the darkest of times, even in the moment of greatest fall. In fact, for the same Christianity, Satan will actually arrive to rule on the earth before the second advent. And this is the final one, by the way. So eschatologically speaking, this was much of the ideology this martyrdom revolved around, because you were basically betting that the church would have won, right? So having contributed to it, there would have been a at the end of time, depending on of course on the victory of the church, which was, again, not in absolute terms to be given for granted, but as long as you would fight for her, perhaps, right? And this is, again, present in all the mythologies, just like the storming of the Asgard. You don't know whether the Aesir will win. We surely know some will die, right? But then the rest is up to you, because otherwise it would be, okay, well, the church will win anyway. No, fighting for it has a meaning that goes beyond. That is actually the same salvation of mankind. So if you have died in this world for the church, there is a chance that you will be saved in the end because of it, because this will eventually impact the entire mankind metaphysically and transcendentally, hopefully. So that's why they were actually claiming that. It was not saying to these men, like, do not care about anything else but dying just for the church. Just you show up and just know that there is a political context for which, of course, you also must be motivated to die, because, who does want to die anyway? Especially in those ways. Just for, saying, okay, I will be saved. Like, it was not a huge saying, okay, well, I want to kill myself because of the church, so I will be saved. And that must be done for a right purpose. There, of course, again, had a very specific context with investiture controversy, the clash against the Normans and against the infidels, and whoever was doing something wrong, which is, at the end of the day, the same way through which technically you could gradually accomplish something anyway in crushing, in defeating. So this was appealing because it was just like an investment for the future, right? It's a bit like Pascal's bet, right? Saying, you may even not believe, but what don't you believe for after all, right? It doesn't cost you anything. Just think, of course, it's a very adulterated take on what religion means. Of course, the 17th century was half of a millennium after this. But the challenges we cope with every day, after all, are part of the greater struggle. So why don't you actually motivate yourself along that pattern and fighting for something that does have And we know just even today, psychologically, anthropologically, much more, an actual role that transcends the same mankind per se. I mean, the idea again that there is have to always be someone who provokes and somebody who, orders in order to evolve. That's literally how our genes are built, and we can't deny that today on any scientific base. So it does fit what a healthy person should be about, psychophysically. In this sense, if somebody was defeated, this could fit again in that specific duel, in that specific combat, the specific battle, or even a war. But this clash was never definitive. I mean, some people at the time had hoped to recur to the ordeal, not to settle the matter, of course, say in a decisive matter, at least as far as human approximations were concerned. I mean, a public issue, a legal one, etc. But going as far as saying, okay, if I win this battle, you are always wrong then. I had a debate actually about this at a conference last month, because the question of asking whether the judgment of God, for example, over the contendants on a battle is definitive or not doesn't make sense, because let's assume those are two polities that fight against each other. There is that battle, and then what? Yes, of course, the winner will have gained something, maybe will have even actually lost some of it in the process, and life goes on. There are still those polities likely, and or people in general, and as we've seen, every human has an influence on another, so this clash can never be definitive. And so if you think that you can, by still participating in that fight, having contributed to a bigger deal that can eventually in afterlife still save you because of the ultimate victory of the system you were fighting for, well, it's a way of looking at your contribution to the salvation of mankind. And that's why it was somehow accepted. It was a good compromise, after all. It does accurately represent the place where we are, right, generally speaking, as middle creatures, right, between God and nothingness. So death in battle, as a consequence, could be a much better incentive for also future generations inside to offer their lives in the defense of the church or any other good or better right cause. The Normans, against whom Leo IX had fought, as we have seen, and lost, by the way, became vassals and allies of the same reforming papacy. Again, they would take up arms against the same Henry IV. They would help the popes in their clash against the empire. They were responsible for literally providing military protection to an elected pope as well, which is an interesting thing, because the papacy had always had its guards, right? Rome had traditionally the Roman militia. Then there were the Scole of the Saxons, of the Franks, of the Longobards, etc., living in the same Rome, that were often used just even to protect the city, say, against the Saracens at a point. And they, of course, represented also a political party per se, because they were connected with international powers. They, of course, were present in, again, the center of the world, because even if you read the pilgrimage journeys from medieval faithful, well, they weren't so impressed with Jerusalem as they were with Rome, right? Rome was really felt deeply by everyone as the spiritual center of Western Christendom, from everywhere, right? The sheer scale of prestige of the papacy for what they had accomplished in the previous millennium was so great that had convinced essentially the entire Western Christendom to even go at war to Jerusalem, and even managing to conquer it, even though they had basically hardly even been there. Well, okay, some had already done, but the military expedition of the barons was, again, as papal divisions in we can't say broadly, were really as we were saying before, like miraculously accomplishing what was in many ways, in fact, also the peak of, in relative terms, of the Roman papacy, because at least by the time of the Second Crusade, as you know, just for the fact that the kings of Germany and France would lead it, of course, you realize that the lay rulers of Europe had rushed to kind of fill that gap, because they thought the papacy would become too powerful, and it would even snatch off those their own vassals, right, to be disposed of. And the reason is that in the Mediterranean, this thing was working, right? The Muslims were being pushed back from Spain, from Sicily, again, by the same guys who had fought against the same papacy. So something redeeming, in a spiritual sense, had been happening, right? The contribution also from the north, as the Normans themselves represent, was consistent. It's as if Western Europe had been injected further blood in her veins in a much greater quantity and flux than before, and was starting to increase again, to increase her muscles again through these actions. And the pumping heart was the papacy, was Rome. In 1059-1060, Pope Nicholas II decreed that an usurper of the papal throne must be driven out, literally, humano auxilio. That is to say, through human help. This is kind of obvious because, as we were saying before, given the church has a spiritual dimension, but also has obviously a temporal one, because you cannot administrate the church otherwise, and so you cannot, again, gnostically pretend that the church cannot have actually a temporal power cooperating with it, right? That even if it's not pro-imperial, is still slipping out of what in theory the imperial order that is universal, cannot afford to control. Well, then you have still again a Holy Ghost, an imperium that is falling on actually those very people, right? Of course, the popes wouldn't say these are our soldiers because the church has just like a temporal power and we can use it however we want. No, this was about, of course, a Christ mimicking, right? Conviction of that human help that was in fact aiding the papacy, that was the righteous cause. And so they were actually contributing to the empire, because the empire is universal, is again the heavenly power that descends eventually on people. And if the emperor is also equally not perfect, and so because he doesn't literally rule every single place in the world directly, and so has not basically transcended our physical laws, in absolute terms, well, of course, there will always be some force escaping from him, which is also kind of a warning from God, essentially of his own sins, because we're all sinners, And so you cannot expect to have anything like a perfect rule, right? But it's also important to see what kind of rule that is, right? Because there is always a better and a worse. Sometimes I get comments on Schwerpunkt telling me, I don't like when, people frame the others as good and evil. Well, nobody, I think, that is saying that person is good and that other is evil, other than people who usually complain about others calling them good and evil, just are actually thinking that there is nothing wrong about a single person in absolute terms, right? This is just a lame way of complaining by actually and timidly not being able to even say out loud that you think that the right ones are the others. And probably the reason why you're not saying it out loud is not just that you lack imperium yourself, but that that is also not true, generally speaking, right? And it's always mostly kind of an extremistic, kind of provoking idea that is, as we've seen, necessary as a fringe concept, but is just a way of, remaining subculturally hidden because you're pretty confused about how things really go, and you just perceive that there is a kind of a higher intelligence, but you still want to say your own thing, and you're for the wrong reasons, because otherwise you would have in fact embraced the right one. And so yes, technically there are the good ones and the evil ones, or at least the right ones or the wrong ones. And you cannot separate the moral judgment, because you cannot be right and being, in this sense, evil as such, because those are, if that is the case, those are two separated things. There's two separated affairs in which you are respectively right and evil. Right? Being right is owning, say, an idea, and actually behaving accordingly to make it work. Right, which, if you don't do to the maximum, still means that you're kind of still evil because you don't give a damn. Right, so if you are evil, say, just because instead you mistreat someone, but maybe you do it for the right reasons, at that point, it's problematic to call you evil, even, or you may be actually evil in other circumstances that will make you wrong, and thus not accomplishing anything along that pattern. Because everything is always paid for. If there is a victim, it's because this person is not strong enough. And the question in that sense of not being strong enough is separated from the conscience of the person that is doing something wrong on you. Or actually, it's even connected, because if you were strong, you would also make up the mind of the person who would do wrong to you and preventing it. And this is the entire logic, in fact, of universal power. So yes, there is always, let's say, at least a better power and a worse power. And that difference is absolute. So you cannot root for the... if you have to choose either of the two, you cannot root for, I don't know, the worst one, because you say, well, but, that's because I think it's, I don't know, there is some of it that is good, and so I will just go for it. No, you can, of course, be convinced by a bad idea, but you will pay for it anyway, because that will not work in reality. And conversely, if of course there is a surpassing, say, in terms of quality, in terms of actual power, because we're talking of actual power, you can have high quality but also not being enough, right? And that's where the absolute standards really come on the fore. You at that point have to be able to recognize who is the one who is actually rising to power, right? Except if they don't succeed, it's because evidently there is something about it that has not been able to convince. And if it's not being able to convince, it's because the people who were to be convinced were also not preemptively molded by the right force that was not right enough evidently to make them understand that was the right one to go. To make a brutal example, if you have never fought for educating people more, you cannot complain if when you say something right, nobody understands you, because in that sense you were wrong not to have educated those people before, not having spent yourself for that. And it's beautiful because it makes you realize that literally everything that happens to you is your fault, which is the true, I mean, everything negative in that case, or everything that comes at you it's the result of this, of your actions anyway. In absolute terms, you can never draw a boundary because they are simply overlapping. It is true. But it was you that had to act or not act, to prevent or not prevent. You cannot complain literally about anything. Right? That really expresses what it means to be a fallen kind of sinners. If you wonder what that actually means, right? And if you remove that awareness, well, it turns out that civilizational collapse happens, right? Because you cannot objectively not realize that your limits are always possible to surpass in some measure that can have an infinite influence on the world. And even though you may not see that, it's because you are limited, in fact. And so you cannot make an excuse for it. It's not an alibi. Coming back to the historical background here, that when you look at the state of affairs in Rome in the third quarter of the 11th century, it was pretty messed up, right? We never made a history of Rome in those very years, but as we have explained countless times, ruling the city was a freaking nightmare. For the same nature, not just the size of it, Rome until the 11th century was still the largest city in the West, and it was, in fact, populated accordingly, and it had powerful noblemen who were absolutely aware of their role internationally, and it was incredibly complicated to maintain control on this city that also was, in fact, in a decentralized area compared to most powers, which rendered the thing even more complicated. A reason for which the popes had ipso facto to militarize themselves if they wanted to have any grip on Roman policy, which was needed anyway. Always rival factions of the families that had put you on the throne and St. Peter's throne and so on. And there were critics at the time on this connection between the papal election and the military might, which I disagree with. As we were saying before, this military might, again, manifests itself only because God allows it. And generally speaking, whoever rules has that capacity of coming closer to God. And so, again, if you manage to have a military support from your side, because simply you had human support on your side of some kind, and let's see what you can do with that. I talked about the early reformers of the Gregorian era. Never quite entered in the details per se. However, we have seen the figure of Peter Damian. That came from these ascetic monastic background of central Italy, which had been probably the blood and soul of the reforming movement in those years. And some of these figures were, however, divergent in ideas. For example, Peter Damian thought this idea of connecting papal election and military might offensive. He complained bitterly about the schism between Alexander II and Cadalus of Parma. It would be Honorius II, for example. As, of course, there had been a war for it. And, of course, one may ask, what's the cost of a war? How good the cost can be, whether, that is worth being fought. It's legitimate, right? It's how strategic analysis is based on, but this doesn't mean that wars shouldn't be fought, or should simply come to an end immediately just because they're wars. That's actually a pretty dumb idea, and more frequently held by people who can't fight and that are, better off with, tyrants on their heads than else, right? So there's always remember that there's hardly any more fascist ideology than pacifism in the first place. and when I say fascism, I can easily mean communism, because at the end of the day, they're the same thing. They're just, socialistic ideologies, just of different degrees of subpersonal abortion of mankind. In any case, nothing to do with the traditional imperium, of course. Peter Damian was complaining mostly about the fact that war was calling out of war, which is also not much of an impressive idea, and that this was essentially instigated by the priesthood. At least he saw in this a kind of, in fact, moral, spiritual problem. In this aspect, he was actually correct, because if you look at the papacy, aside from, again, the disgustingly undereducated anti-clerical ideology we live nowadays in, throughout all its existence, fought, if anything, to pacify. Right? When I say fought, I mean mostly without arms, of course, to compact, to favor, peaceful solution. When two Christian powers fought against each other, it intervened, trying to settle the matter, also on a juridical base and so on. So this is basic papal history. It's not Christian propaganda. It's literally what they did, because it was pretty evident that, again, a much greater advantage would come from a political compaction and pacification. There's no doubt that popes fought also to disrupt certain realities, because they thought that they would have at that point taken over the papal states that were not a military might per se, and that therefore could be easily weaponized also spiritually if somebody had taken control of them. So that was, at least for them, a legitimate way for making war. And again, from the side of the church, you have always to listen to it, again, as much as from the side of the empire. But mostly, the papal actions were incredibly successful as far as the defense of Christendom and actually its further expansion and consolidation were concerned. We've seen it basically in every age. We can talk about the Crusades, the Reconquista, but as late as we've seen it for the siege of Vienna in the 17th century. Without papal diplomacy and money, Vienna would have fallen. This is, pretty well known historiographically. So we're looking at a player in Western civilization that has been so, in fact, significant in general for its universal meaning that it's impossible to pretend that the masses wouldn't hate for some reason, because the masses always hate who is above them, without questioning why they are under, right? Which is literally the worst thing you can do on any traditional base. And Peter Damian was, however, again, probably part of such idea, because he stressed essentially that only the king could have, so who held the regnum or the imperium, have recourse to the secular arm, right? The church must confine herself to the word of God, but actually the word of God is pretty violent, notoriously enough, and actually being a Christian has barely anything to do with actually committing violence, or not just per se. It's why you do, or why you are, brought by the circumstances to use that, which doesn't mean it's not a sin. That's also how deep this, of course, the Christianity is in general, with the double thread, of course, of the temporal and the spiritual sides that have always to confront each other. There's no easy answer to things. You have to find out yourself, and mostly through a struggle, because that's at the end of the day, the core message of the gospel, and beyond. Peter Damian was, in other words, defending I can't even say the traditional, but rather the theoretical division of functions between the secular and the spiritual power. But it's a pretty abstract and somehow extremistic idea, because what does this mean in practice, right? Where how can you separate? It's like pretending to separate the body from the soul. It doesn't make any sense, right? We are in this human condition exactly because we can't separate the two things. And the only way to recompact everything, right? Because that's also the ultimate aim, right? Is in terms of universal power, is to work through both. Right, so the point there is not a confusion between somebody using both elements, the spiritual and the temporal one, to achieve anything, because the result is still meant to become one. And it's not by, again, gnostically splitting the two things that you are going to accomplish anything, or just actually to make everything collapse. Because it's humanly impossible, in fact, to just act spiritually without even having a contemporary, also temporal consequence on it, right? Even if this had to come just from an ascetic background that Peter Damian actually had, and that's why probably he was, pretty idealistic in this in this circumstance. The ultimate goal is still to act through that Christ mimicking, right? And to make things work in the end, because otherwise the thing will collapse. So one thing is dividing the two aspects conceptually. Another thing is realizing that you can never completely separate them as long as you are human, as long as you belong to this world. Taking matters in your own hands, whichever they are, if you really think you can lead. And this is what the church must do, and something that, again, it was doing pretty damn well against the infidels, for example, at that point. And it is still required a cooperation with a temporal authority, because, again, the papacy was not even, it had, a power on its own, but it was pretty modest. Temporally speaking, I mean, the spiritual one was immense, and consequently also the temporal one, but just indirectly through others. So, what was the actual possibility of even reaching those absolute standards of sanctity without providing others with an explanation if they are faulty? And thus inviting them even to take up arms that would be naturally wielded to defend the church at that point. The church was convincing enough. That's actually what the same emperor was doing. Those who approved the military measures taken by the church naturally appealed to the precedent of Leo IX, who was considered a saint in spite of his warmongering. Damian would not accept this. Good and evil, he said, must not be judged according to the merits of those who possess them, but according to their own nature, which is also kind of also pretty Gnostic sounding thing. He would literally write in a letter, cum mala vel bona non pro meritis considerentur habentium, sed ex propris debeant qualitatibus judicari. Right, so it's as if to say that the works are not important as long as you are somehow innerly okay. And what kind of thing is this? Like, what kind of schizophrenic concept is it? Basically, you know what's good, but you don't do it. Right? That's where eventually you see what the elements that do not take matters in their own hands, are not habituated to, end up thinking like. Right? Needless to say, the papal monarchy was to evolve with a massive temporal power as well. So things didn't surely end like Damian would have wanted to this day. But it's something we should actually rejoice of. And actually, if it wasn't for the fact that, of course, most of our moral standards collapsed anyway, to the point that we rejected even religion largely as a guiding force. For Damien, whatever the end, it could not justify the means, because these would have somehow, in fact, stained the purity of the church. So if the means used by the church was force, this was sacrilegious, and thus there was no way of willing it. This is, again, pretty bizarre, because we're not talking de facto of a church that was advocating for anything, right? Not just bloodshed for the sake of it. The sake was obviously transcendental. So how do you do anything, right? And what action is actually just, in absolute terms, acceptable, right? Okay, not killing, there are some commandments and more, but these are approximations, right? They're just some guidelines, say, okay, don't do this, but there is always a deeper reason, right? It's never the action per se, and that's where, in fact, the must contextualize that where the church would head to, in terms even of judging the penance that was always associated to any, in this case, any kind of bloodshed, for example. I made a couple of videos about penitence in early medieval Europe that arrives as late as the 11th. In fact, we will quote something similar here from the bloodshed had occurred after Hastings, because again, even major battles, major bloodshed were a huge deal, right? You would think that nobody cared, right? That there is this idea that priests came about and people normally just would kill each other without concern. That they wouldn't. They lived those lives pretty aware of the fact that every action had dramatically consequential implications that could even just boomerang against those who thought they were being right, but actually would cause some tragedy. It's the entire leitmotif of the Germanic epos, right? Just think about Siegfried. Nobody's invincible, and nobody thought that just shedding blood would solve the matter per se. Also because they had a very consistently Clausewitzian ideology already at the time, that we forgot in the moment of which, in fact, we were separated from the responsibility of taking such actions. And just kids nowadays think that, there is no, again, spiritual implication in just force per se, and believe that tradition is basically a joke, and exactly the diametrically opposite meaning of the heavenly rulers, as opposed, in fact, to the barbaric chthonic forces. Because again, this knowledge was normal, right? People just went through political struggle, wars, social issues in a way that just exemplified constantly what the deal practically was, right? And Peter Damien, in this regard, was stepping with his criticism by claiming that, of course, the wars that were being fought by the church were for its own cause, not for the one of God, which also is problematic, as we have just seen, because you do need that institution in the first place. So this institution must be up to some standards, but what are the standards just in terms of the universal spectrum? How do you think you can actually solve problems practically with a fallen kind that doesn't embody the institution, but definitely those who hold the office? It was a huge deal just to make certain things happen. I mean, again, with all the rudimentary Latin Germanic political and social apparatus, you have this boom, the Reconquista, the Crusades. Without the papacy, that couldn't happen, right? And actually times were mature now, because that thing had been in the air for quite a while, everybody knew essentially how it was supposed to work, because it was part of a universal understanding, right? Universal mechanism. Nothing new here, right? So there is a degree, even of alienation, that Peter Damian somehow embodies regarding to this picture, because it probably was well intentioned as far as at least the theory was concerned, but if it is wrong, or it doesn't realize that in order even to achieve something great, you have to sin, hopefully, of course, so doing less damage than the good you accomplish. Well, you're also kind of denying human nature. You're thinking that just we can simply solve the problem by ourselves. No. Saint Christ prophesied a continuous string of disasters, and the focus on the spiritual side of the story doesn't mean that the temporal one was not to be wielded. So that is what also a monastic perspective, an ascetic perspective, was making reflect on, but still connected with the connecting the spiritual and the temporal, unavoidably. Because otherwise Christ would have never even addressed like real people, right? Not just Caesar per se. Damian's lament thus shows mostly what arguments were expressed at the time, generally speaking, as he was a pretty famous figure. It's in fact worth noticing that the papacy was influencing the politics of certain wars fought outside, right, the immediate territorial interests of the Roman Church, right? Actually, this had been what Rome had been doing since ever, right? And the papacy as well. There was that aforementioned necessity to mitigate the excesses, to become more orderly, more disciplined, to channel the Christian forces outside, so at least by expanding the Western Christendom and pacifying the latter. And especially during the pontificate of Alexander II, you see quite important military expeditions for European history. First of all, the Norman conquest of Islamic Sicily. The latter I made a video about. Alexander called for help in the Iberian Reconquista. So essentially calling troops to go to the aid of the Christian monarchies there. And Hildebrand, at least, even though we talk about Hildebrand of Savannah, right? So later Pope Gregory II, so the one from which the reforming papacy takes its name from, and in fact the most clearly kind of also political and theoretical as far as the papal prerogatives were concerned, gave his support to William the Conqueror when he went in 1066 to seize the crown of Christian England, even though the war was framed as a crusade, right? In none of the cases that we just listed, the war was instigated by the papacy, right? The Normans had already essentially stepped into Sicily as mercenaries. Same goes for England in a also deeper cultural sense. The Reconquista was just historically going on since ever. The Roman papacy had immediately supported the Christian Iberians as soon as basically the Muslims destroyed the Visigothic kingdom, and also in exchange for the recognition of the Roman Rite as opposed to the Visigothic one in Spain. But all these enterprises were kind of just blessed by the Pope. They not caused by it. What the Roman Church was doing was saying, okay, we are, as an international player, aware, of course, as they were, of what was going on. I mean, they had a church there. Rome was building that hierarchy right now, and of course, we've seen it. We've made videos about Augustine of Canterbury, a lot of, different examples of how, of course, especially during the 11th century, Rome was, so before the reform, was already headed towards that kind of monarchic direction, and they knew the church everywhere. They managed the entire ecclesiastical establishment administratively, in the pastoral activities. They educated people. They sent there, the highest, in fact, clergy of Europe that would have become also papacy at some point, and in some instances, and that were all radiating culturally, religiously, spiritually from Rome as the model that the Roman Church had installed since the beginning all over Western Christendom. So these were lands where the papacy stood at least as a watching eye, and knew the people, knew the hierarchies, knew the politics, lay and ecclesiastical alike, and was saying, look, in this case, be just go for it if you have to decide that they thought was right. There were Christians even in Islamic Spain, just for instance, but we don't know so much about this. But of course, in the there were lots of communities that just had as a single reference the Church of Rome, and just asked, hoped, just informed. Just the intelligence here was incredible. That's also why Rome was developing necessarily towards a statual monarchic direction, with even a military. Because how can you achieve that civilizational accomplishment without such order? It doesn't make any sense. And just those who were not accepting to be disciplined and arbitered and evaluated and controlled from a quality supervisor, but say, no, I want to keep doing whatever the hell I want. And that's actually not how civilization worked, as all the opponents involved here found out the hard way. In Sicily and in England, accounts written by the conquerors set the war in a religious context. They wanted to frame it, of course, for political reasons, as if the papacy had just launched a crusade, had fully supported the enterprise, and God was from their side. And this reflected, naturally, the fact that, albeit there was almost an hegemonic church, at least from a spiritual point of view, there was hardly, in the 11th century, we've seen it very often, a political cohesion in Europe. So all these powers were essentially competing with each other to prove themselves they were, superior, to legitimize their political and territorial, achievements, and naturally their military actions. The combatants, for example, used to make, famously enough, their confession before battle. The idea was that, the tension was so high, the things would be seen in such a much more concrete perspective, and so a morally objective one in the face of the ultimate judgment that, as we've seen, even martyrdom entailed in combat. So at that point you say, you know what, all what I was complaining about in my life, it was BS, right? It's an ascetic experience, right? So the confession, the repentance from the sins, is a moment of definitive moral purification before the ultimate code, the self-sacrifice the battle can entail. So this was beautifully and mystically lived, as of course the eschatological perspective that we highlighted before helps framing, especially as far as the motivation for the bloodshed, not the justification, because it was always a sin. Nobody ever claimed otherwise, right? People think that just they were asking them to shed blood as a positive thing. It wasn't. It was the ultimate spiritual purpose of it all. The rest was sinful because, humanity, especially in this, more lower dimension of itself, is going to do things that are terrifying, and that are a sin against the creation, because they are meant to destroy the rebel. They're meant to essentially bend him in ways that evidently just convincingly were not enough. But still, at that point, God had produced that clash accordingly to solve the matter, and it was always the both contendants' responsibility for it. It had to be settled. So the same force that opposed, even the right side, was considered to be part of a universal order, where in fact the right side is, and everyone actually, is come to be tested. Because sometimes you don't even know, humanly speaking, whether you're right or wrong, as it's pretty self-evident. It doesn't mean that there isn't such a thing. And again, if you consider war as a clash of moral forces, you actually understand that the way of settling the battle is not just for killing, but as von Clausewitz says, to compel the enemy to fulfill your will, which is actually what happens, because not the majority of people were killed, or even wounded, but it would be enough to shatter the cause, because war is just a means to an end, and that's why it's fought, and so it's extremely relevant. So participation in battle per se was not in contradiction to any penance which these troops had to do for sins committed, right? It was other sins that had occurred, and hopefully in battle you would achieve something greater than the same sins were. It may seem strange, a bit too mathematically retributive, but it still does make sense, because in absolute terms you add something more to it. You're not kind of separating the two things in a morally relativistic way. Again, if the cause is right and you act in a certain manner, of course, even killing an enemy, it's not a big deal. It depends on the cause, it depends on everything. I made videos on political and military theory, on how to even frame the idea of victory and defeat, which are relative to, of course, a political context that is faulty, right? But it is to be observed from the individual perspective to be understood, especially in terms of conscience and how much this person understands. In fact, this is exactly the direction, interestingly enough, towards which the papacy was going when evaluating these actions. There is a passage from actually Geoffrey Malaterra in the De Rebus Gestis Rogeri. So this is a Siculo-Norman source, but it claims that Alexander the Second offered absolution to the soldiers willing to drive the Saracens out of Sicily. Literally, absolutionem de offensis si recipiscentes in futurum caveant mandat. Because evidently the cause was good enough, right? It essentially removed an important region of Europe from the error that was not just laying in the Saracen presence, but in the fact that the Saracens could rule over that place, because the people, after all, had been kind of okay with that. It could be cultivated better under a Christian rule, as the Siculo-Norman kingdom also, proved to succeed in. The war against the heathen was an integral part of the penance, just per se, right? It became a token of the soldiers' obedience to God's commands. Of course, it was a terrifying experience. Somebody thought that going at war was just per se, okay, just as we were saying before, just do it. There was a test entailed in here. So, you don't actually, again, according to the traditional view, you don't really get anything back that you don't deserve. Even fighting has that, because if you went there just thinking to win easy, you would just show up a poor commitment and likely lose. And so a true motivation, right, standing your ground in the face of death, is really what shows what people are made of, and what the better people are made of. When they are, of course, rightly motivated, because you can never separate the two things. So the cause is crucial, too. There was also a change operated during the Gregorian reforms, albeit gradually, that would point at the fact that we would deal with the principle, at least, that the penitents should bear no weapon, right? Because these were instruments of death, and so the concept was that a military lifestyle, just per se, constant contact with blood, etc., and sinning and death, which is not only connected to the killing, by the way, but just being out there in the world, and so against any, temptation, any devilish influence that could tempt you, and weaken you, and kind of wearing you out, which was all well psychophysically understood by, say, military prototypes like the Normans, right? I made a video actually about the 11th century Italo-Norman horsemen at this point, because it's fascinating. Well, they were told essentially that even weapons themselves were such an instrument of destruction that in general were better left at least to people who professionally wielded them. And so this was actually the case at that point, in an increasingly feudalizing reality by certain standards. So I made a video about angels who kill everything they touch, which is actually from the Parsifal as a line, but it's referring exactly to this kind of damnation / this liminal status of the warrior, like between damnation and salvation, because you cannot have the latter without risking the former, right? So the idea is this was dangerous, and it would have been preferable not to have things to fight for if the world, in fact, had been like Peter Damien would like it to be, where everything works the way it does. But unfortunately, it's not the case. So it was obviously understood civilizationally that, again, in order to do the right thing, you also had to do something bad, right? The Gregorian papacy understood clearly that things had to be modified along that pattern, just as a posture, because they would never say that, again, killing was not a sin. It's just in the Holy Scriptures, and it's intrinsic to the universal order, because every life is sacred, because it can, in potential, even save the world, and it has an infinite potential. That by killing, you're automatically severing, saying to God, like, I am to a certain level of understanding so high that I understand that this is the right thing to do. Like, I don't know, killing Hitler in his stroller, right? Or, putting parents at the Battle of Stalingrad. You may see that as monstrous as the times and the context were happening. I was just thinking about the two things separated, but then I realized that it was Hitler that was sending the Nazis to kill actually also Putin's brother at not at Stalingrad, at Leningrad, as a matter of fact, and that is St. Petersburg. But you get what I mean, and that is a good example, because again, if you had killed just an Austrian child back in the late 1900s, you would have been considered a monster and whatever. But if you had known eventually in this unpredictable world what would have produced, well, of course you would have shot the motherfucker, right? Probably you would have tried to change him, because I guess people in fact are not born just Nazi dictators, but you would have tried, of course, to change course of action. And you can never say through all the things you do which course of actions reality will take anyway. So this concept of wisdom that is connected also probably with vision in tradition, and with intelligence, because which literally means to read through in Latin. So something that goes beyond what the common people see, or at least what common knowledge is a crucial civilizational capacity. And the idea that there was an ever more enterprising elite that was getting the things done, and there was more literacy, more wealth, more capacity to constructively operate, naturally entailed the refinement of a military instrument, thus also of a religious ideology. This had already been experimented historically by essentially setting some degrees of penitence that was always kind of personalized according to the actions, to the sins, to the context, and so on. Alexander II, for example, was regulating this, and the intrinsic principle of this is the fact that every man has a duty to defend justice, right? So, not just that, but given that we all struggle to understand what the absolute justice is, right? So, what the truth is, has to unavoidably take matters in their own hands, right? If, again, Peter Damian had been right, at this point we would have all be dead. Because in the moment you realize that every action can lead to complete disaster, even indirectly, as also every action is intertwined, and so we're all kind of sinners also because of this. By the way, remember that. You must approximately, as a patch, but still better than nothing, give room to autonomy, right? It can't be just a rigidly crystallized thing again, unless God reigned supreme everywhere, and we had not fallen. That would have been the thing, but it's not the case. And actually, we have a duty also in the eye of God to deal with creation, exactly, to get out there and literally getting our hands dirty, as long as we can fix things, and training ourselves to do so, even though the system around us is collapsing, mostly because of our fault. So it's a constant strain against spiritual, the odds at the end of the day. That's why there is the whole thing of Satan, of the gates of hell should not prevail, because it's a much more seriously and disturbingly spiralingly the degenerative process, right? And so you cannot simply stay aside from it. You must get into the fray if you want to get anything out. In battle, I mean, the entire Christology is based on cosmic struggle, holy war. That's what it is. It's the entire principle of any civilization, and perhaps best of all, the Western one. 4 years after the Battle of Hastings, the English Church, now under the Normans, held the synod. In fact, in the presence of a papal legate, right, which laid down for William the Conqueror's soldiers one of the few penances for killing in battle. In other words, they called the synod to determine what were the proper penitence to be performed because of the bloodshed of 1066. 4 years later, right? So you understand how impacting this thing was, because it wasn't just, okay, you know, the battle is over. In the next couple of days, I will make penitence and it will end, right? You know, the whole thing had to be appropriate, and it had to be determined by an authority. As a matter of fact, the highest one from a spiritual point of view. And it was something collective, as you understand. I mean, as personalized as it was, still it was felt that what had happened at Hastings was just such a big deal that, of course, you know, even just battles of that scale were rare, so one could debate on that, but it was probably just something more than it. It was more than the military thing. It's even more than the bloodshed. It's just the Normans had literally invaded and conquered England, that, by the way, in these years was also being ravaged in the north by some, in fact, hotbeds of Anglo-Saxon rebellion, some of the single most brutally violent, in fact, repressions that eventually the Normans carried out. So it was a continuous problem, a never-ending one, right? Naturally, you can imagine some Norman knights didn't give a damn about this penitence just per se, but you could never rule out the fact that what occurred had modified the world, as we know, climatically, to this very day, and so you had to just think yourself within what you had done. So to even stimulate a kind of an improvement of your person, not just a fixing for what had been done, but of course, a step further, because in the Bible, of course, the redeemed son is even better than the one that has actually never sinned, or has not sinned, at least by some degree. So the synod in 1070 made, in fact, casuistic distinctions between the degrees of punishment. Penance was also incumbent on those who had not actually killed anybody, but had been ready to do so. How clever is that? Right? It's not even, you sin first of all with the mind, not with the body. Right? It's pretty obvious. Right? What pertains to the material side of the story basically is not relevant. It's what you do. Right? It's, again, what's the sin of blood? Of course, there is a somatic understanding of reality for which blood is just, even materially, of course, capable of infecting you for the same sin that you have done to carry out that killing, right? But the point is inherent, is spiritual mostly. It has to do, as we were saying before, with the probably with the idea that there's a divine potential in life, and you cannot simply get away with killing someone, right? Somebody who has a divine spark and potential in them. And you see it even in art, that the idea, I don't know, think about Judith and Holofernes, when in Caravaggio, for example, when she severs the head of the guy, and you can see she's moving in a way that that is avoiding being stained with the blood, because it would have been impure, or to be. That's just a poetical note per se, and she was the good one and he was the bad one. So in that case, the killing is a beautiful example, artistically speaking, in fact, of how even just a just cause still entails, cannot remove the sin from killing in that case. So any damage you make to life per se. This is a beautiful idea, by the way. And it's all around us, the Western art and beyond. So even having been ready to kill someone is a huge deal. I mean, even if you live close to a person that has never killed someone, would like this person to constantly plan to kill? At some point you would say, well, they're not going to do it anyway, but it's a huge deal, because you don't want to have anything to do with this person. It's actually a living threat of some sort, and his actions are still dictated in a way by that. And they're not productive. It's not occupying his soul with better things he could do. Assuming, of course, even in that case, killing just per se is the deal, not something else. In the second half of the 11th century, there was somehow a twofold development. Since we're being increasingly measured according to the mindset of the sinner, right? And naturally also the context, right? So not according to the deed itself, as we just said, it's not just killing per se, right? This has to do with why, how. And this also applied to killing in battle. In other words, this was also a way, if you think about it, to reconstruct what happened, which must have been very interesting as far as penitence was concerned, because today you just go to a priest and you just confess your sins, and you are, if you're truly contrived and ready to make up for them, you're absolved according to the mechanism. But if you understand that penitence is to be carried out actually, and here we're leaving a lot of benefit of the doubt, people will actually learn the thing, that the sacrament is valid, but it's not going to be fulfilled if you don't actually, if you're not convinced, right? So that's the important thing of it all, and it's actually sacrilegious to lie about it to the church about that. But it's when you have to, in fact, be punished much more concretely, you have also to be specific about what happened, and that's what they were aiming at the time to do. Because the question is, okay, how many people did you kill? Just think about what an 11th century knight was. I mean, these people in their lives, easily killed, I don't know, how many? 200, 300 people? I don't know. Maybe less, probably. But let's say in general, they were surely up to that. They were conceived. I'm talking about probably the ultra-heavy knight. To do that. They were up to that. It's what they were trained since they were children to do. They were properly designed mentally to kill large numbers of people, because they were military, and that's objectively what the military is specifically designed to do. And of course the church was saying, we do need these people to defend the Christian world and to render justice also in a broader sense. Also deterrence there is important, as you understand, but the question was, how many people did you kill? How, when, against whom, in which war? How did you kill them? Right? And this changes a huge deal, because it's no more nor less what like an attorney would, just like in a trial, you would be asked to describe, to assess what happened in the first place. So that entails also a great deal of conscience work on your side, and in front of a community that lying is bad and that the Holy Ghost, according to tradition, does not fly over those who tell even a single lie. Remember that, because that's in the other. It's in the ancient Iranian language allegiance. There is extensive evidence of that. That it's just one lie is enough to lose all power you have. Right. Everybody must be up to those standards. So penitence in that case should demonstrate not so much a rejection of the world at all, on the contrary, but on the contrary, a fresh turning to God. God wants you to embrace the world as far as you are spiritually predisposed to do it for the right reason. As a consequence, penitence could be combined with the use of arms in defense of justice and the church. So the thing worked like that. You had gone in a crusade or fought, again, on behalf of the church against her enemies. You had killed, say, 3 people. What about that? It's a sin. You have to expiate that. Literally, I've made a couple of videos which we literally read the Christian penitentials of the early Middle Ages, even in the 11th, because these ones are pretty famous, that they're documented at the time of Hastings. And they tell you exactly what you had to do. You were temporarily disconfessed, essentially. So you actually found yourself in a dangerous place where if you died before having carried out the penitence, you were actually to pay for it in ways that, of course, even there are metaphysically debatable, but were a huge deal for these people. And these were men who died, let's say, easily, and especially after battles, right? If septicemia kicked in, like you were done for. Maybe you didn't have time to, if you had carried a manslaughter in the process, to pay for it adequately. Naturally, everything was approximated by degrees that you can debate, because some of these penitents are very, material, contractualistic. They are just not such a huge deal. But we don't know fully the entire implications of this. That's why I like to toy with the idea, because you realize, again, individuals like Norman cavalry men were just also probably, not dismissive of the issue that, again, was crucial to them, because in all the sagas, the thing was always the same. There was some crippling issue that, because you had screwed up at some point in your life and you're going to pay for it with something much worse. That's basically the entire sagas, how they work. And the some end well, actually, but the original ones especially were highlighting this aspect. And they still, however, considering that roughness and primitiveness, these people were just also, you can say they were illiterate in a broader sense, but they had, again, an incredibly crude psychological background that did entail these things for them to actually care about this. It wasn't the church enforcing them, it was just a consensual thing, because it was recognized to be necessary to that kind of lifestyle, right? And functional, again, to a broader international order like the one that the Roman Church was creating. There are some interesting examples with which we close about the Reconquista that Alexander II supported substantially, right? So first of all, if you left for Spain, you were told to make your confession and receive penitence. Alexander then remitted it and granted these men forgiveness for their sins. In fact, which doesn't mean you would simply expiate them all. right? Just the cause, however, seemed a huge deal for essentially them to be mitigated substantially. These men would be able to bring their undertaking to a successful conclusion because they had begun it literally divinitus admoniti. That is to say, they had been admonished in a godlike fashion, right? In other words, God had told them what they were going through Christ's vicar on earth, right? So the Pope took on the responsibility of essentially schooling these people in what the deal was, also to motivate them, because much of this whole thing was to literally indoctrinate the people to actually understand why they were fighting for. It's actually a very useful thing, because in order to win, it must be real, right? And incidentally, they won, and on a large scale. So we understand that kind of indoctrination was the right one, right? Not indoctrinating someone doesn't necessarily mean you're indoctrinating them to become idiots or fanatics. You actually can't literally teach them, because that's what you have to learn doctrinally, and to understand better why you are there, what you're fighting for. So the remission of the adventurers' penitence by the readiness to make war on the heathen seemed also, from a personal point of view, probably something to be wary of in general, meaning that they knew probably that it was not enough per se. But it's as if they had had angels on their shoulders, as that was the right cause. And so something that it was worth reflecting on its redeeming function, because after all, they were going there to die with a good probability. So in order to do so, of course, they had other interests that were more material, but they naturally wanted to make this about the right thing. This was reflected also by the knightly dream to always die in a great battle, because most of them, not just because most of them would die in a ditch, with a putrescent body, and or consuming itself without any glory in their shit. But also because the great battle, as scenographic as it could be, also, as we've seen, had a greater political meaning. I mean, dying at Hastings was not just like dying in any other siege of some Western Frankish moat that nobody would eventually remember. It was just the battle that, in fact, we remember to this day. And it was conceived, in fact, in a sacred fashion, just as those who failed in it were thought to have failed in a broader political and social and sense. It's also culturally and spiritually, other than just militarily. The same is, of course, in the memory of these same people. Just look at Snorri Sturluson's account of the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Well, it's obvious that the recurrent theme of the arrow there probably echoed the stories on Hastings and so on. But it's, of course, a mark of divine judgment. Take an arrow in the eye. That's stuff you can date to millennia before. Even in the Bible, it's properly, again, the idea that the vision, so what can give you properly the understanding of reality in a transcendental sense, is blinded by your own misdeed, by the fact that you were not fit enough to win. I mean, it's as brutal as it sounds. It's what literally these same people believed. And that's why they were so careful about it, because they knew that what was at stake there was eternal life, in which everybody believed, because it was normal to still think that the divine potential of human was there, and that now the Roman Church was facilitating the process, hopefully. Given that it was quite a while that people didn't transfigure into, into something else. I would just hope that. There are interesting references to that also in the pagan literature, at least the one that was written down already in Christian times, but the meaning is there, it's millenary, it exists since ever, right? Naturally, very important was defining the war itself, as we were saying before, as a work of penitence. Naturally, this helped as far as, of course, the war in itself counted for some sort of penitence, right? So if somebody had naturally committed atrocious sins, still the idea is that they had done it at an extreme cost, and this could be subtracted from the penitence that would have still had to be done formally later, so that this could be more bearable by some degree. So, of course, this was important as well. Alexander II wouldn't actually go as far as that, because the normal practice probably entailed the idea that, again, fighting is even licit. Nobody really thinks that it's something bad, even just per se to fight, to be at war. I mean, the entire world worked like that, right? The problem is, again, the penitence. You want to do something, okay, you have to be regulated accordingly, right? A way, however, the papacy could also implement this was defining also the criteria for the just war. I talked about this in other videos. Look at the peace of God, the truth of God, this kind of things. For example, there was not to be such a thing like a war against the Jews, who were submitted to Christianity and actually were also quite functional to it, especially in these years. As you know, the church would be incredibly protective of the Jews, and so were all the highest lay authorities, because essentially, again, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, anti-Semites were just lesser people who, were, even in their own mindset, just to do those things less than what they thought of the Jews, evidently. In fact, they wanted just to steal their riches and all this stuff that, normally just some Jews, in virtue of functionaries, that they weren't the ones who could handle money in the Christian world, and that's the reason why they were associated with that, not just in a kind of devilish sense, because the Christians were saying that Jews would die anyway, in sin, and they were spared actually because they had to be just the witness of the second advent, and just because they were, of course, Christians and Jews had scriptures in common, so it was possible, right? But the truth was that targeting the Jews, the lesser people targeted the elite, right? And so it's always like what you see today, that lesser people do not accept to be what they are, and so they have to make up conspiracy theories with the Jews governing the world and all this stuff, and not realizing that even if there were anything wrong anywhere with anyone, if you suffer that, it means you're under, so you're not a better person at all, right? So that's the lunacy that, of course, already at the time saved. But the bishops, of course, in this case, beautifully unleashed their own military power to repress anybody who would touch the Jews, which were often protected, in fact, in time, within the castles, within the possessions. This is incredibly important when you study the history of the medieval Jewry, because they had a pivotal role actually in the development of Western civilization that the fourth estaters cannot afford to accept nowadays, and make up, in fact, their own devilish bullshit about. The war on the Saracens, on the contrary, was permissible because the Saracens were essentially rebels, right? The Jews were integrated, they were working, they were doing everything. The Saracens, too, in some cases. In fact, it was full of Muslims, especially in Spain, Constantinople, were the Islamic merchant in Sicily too, as you know. But these Saracens were the armed ones, the polities that were fighting actively against the Christians, and that had in the previous centuries essentially invaded Christian lands and done what they did. And even in that case, actually, you could make a difference between, for example, the Jews that had supported those and those who didn't. I mean, in Jerusalem, even Christians were slaughtered by the Crusaders because why? Because it's like the anti-clerical bullshit you've been told by your leftist professors. No, it's because those Christians fought alongside the Seljuks to keep the Crusaders all away, because they were different in confession, they were different in just in culture. We're another people, right? So there are all the non-religious reasons behind that, and it's all completely normal in a way. But just to make that example, killing a Christian there would have required a greater penitence than killing a Muslim, which is, or at least even in here, depending on the circumstance, depending whether they were actual soldiers or innocents or other stuff. So, and justice did work, as a matter of fact. It wasn't like an anarchic reality. The papacy in the period we looked at today didn't actually arm the Reconquista, because the Iberian princes and bishops were actually already doing it well on their own. As we've seen, the papacy just sent allowed, let's say, knights from elsewhere, mostly from France, etc., to go fight there. Right, there had been literally, I don't know, Italian fleets that had supported the Reconquista of the Aragonese, right? The Mediterranean coast. There had been Scandinavians that, as you know, would pass by and just in a bit in that kind of Viking old style, and even settled down there, even outside of the control of the local Iberian rulers, and eventually would be integrated. So it was just a way, let's go there and do it, for reasons that could also be, you can say they were completely unrelated to spiritual matters, because everything was clearly outlined at the time being so. The point, though, that the papal power was such morally that would, of course, greatly help the same Reconquista as far as, for example, the prerogatives of the local rulers to organize it militarily were concerned. This, of course, entailed other branches of government, such as the foundation of new dioceses and things like that, especially in the newly conquered territories and so on. So, when you look, for example, at the dedication of the Cathedral of Barcelona in 1058, you look at Count Ramon Berenguer I that we discussed recently in some videos about the Reconquista, regarding especially this Catalonian political compaction, the system of the parias that had been enforced on the Islamic taifas. So this precious metal drainage from the center, the south of Spain, to the north, to Christian north, because, of course, of the military might that these rulers could leverage on the Muslims now. And that when, in fact, we look at Count Ramon Berenguer I, we see, of course, a further expansion under him through those military means. Well, all this was blessed, of course, by the papacy, and the dedication of the Cathedral of Barcelona sounded something like this. That is, propter honorem Christi et sancte crucis gloriam, ut nobis de barbaris per crucis triumphum det victoriam. That is to say, that for the honor of Christ and the glory of the Holy Cross, may God give us victory over the barbarians right? Remember the barbarians as what everybody believed the barbarians were. It's not an ethnographic invention to revive 19th century social Darwinism. The barbarians are present in every mythology, right? They are the stupid guys, in other words, especially also the larger ones, but dumber ones, just to make the point. Through the triumph of the cross, which is actually, of course, meant in a military sense. I mean, the cosmic struggle, the battle par excellence in the entire folklore is the foundational moment of a new order, and the order of Christ. So, safeguarding the peace of God necessitates military action. You cannot have any peace without military power displayed or displayable in deterrence. And these are all crusading motives, in fact, that are, any intelligent, rational person has, and that also are openly displayed by the Reconquista nobility in their struggle against the Al-Andalus. And there is so much to tell about these topics, as you understand, but I can't go on talking forever at every video. I would like to, so increasing the stats, because somebody would forget to stop the video and would go on for 10 hours in a row. But I actually stop it here. We will keep talking about these topics a lot. The 11th century we haven't covered so well yet, right? For today, however, I stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.